Hey y'all, what's good? Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. Prepare to be sick of me because I have a lot of talking to do today regarding Diddy and these possible federal investigations slash federal charges slash grand jury indictments, so on and so forth. But for this specific video, we're going to go over the lawsuit that was filed by Jane Doe. Make sure you watch until the end of the video because I do have some updates regarding this specific lawsuit. So let's get into it. November 16, 2023, Cassandra Ventura, aka Cassie, filed a 35-page lawsuit in which she exposed Sean Combs for subjecting her to nearly a decade of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, punctuated by rape, trafficking, and being forced to engage in drug-fueled, non-consensual sexual encounters with other men. Ordinarily, when a lawsuit such as Mrs. Ventura's is filed that involves events that took place long ago, witnesses are far and few between and evidence hard to muster. Not so for the claims brought against Mr. Combs. Within minutes of the filing, Ms. Ventura's claims were confirmed by various witnesses, including a rival musician whose car Mr. Combs blew up, as well as various individuals who observed Mr. Combs beat Ms. Ventura. Only a few days later, two other lawsuits were filed against Mr. Combs. In one, plaintiff Joy Dickerson Neal alleged that Mr. Combs drugged and sexually assaulted her when she was a college student. The other lawsuit accused Mr. Combs and singer Aaron Hall of forcing the plaintiff and another unidentified woman into non-consensual sex. At the time the fourth lawsuit was filed, this one against Mr. Combs' company and defendant Harv Pierre, the longtime president of Bad Boy Entertainment. The suit alleged that Mr. Pierre used his position of power at Bad Boy to groom and sexually assault his former assistant, and that Bad Boy looked the other way at the time. This is now the fifth lawsuit filed against Mr. Combs in the last 3 weeks. Incredibly, the allegations brought by Ms. Doe are in many ways even more egregious than those brought by his prior victims. Specifically in 2003, when she was only 17 years old and in the 11th grade, Ms. Doe was trafficked and raped by multiple people, including Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and a third assailant. In short, excuse me, when she was just a teenager, Ms. Doe met Mr. Pierre and a third assailant in a lounge in the Detroit, Michigan area. While at the lounge, Mr. Pierre insisted that he was best friends with Mr. Combs and even called Mr. Combs with Miss Doe. Mr. Combs convinced Miss Doe, who was half his age at the time, to accompany Mr. Pierre and the third assailant on a private jet to come to his studio in New York City. Before they left for the private jet, Mr. Pierre smoked cocaine in the rock form in a bathroom at the lounge, in which he also sexually assaulted Miss Doe by forcing her to give him oral. Mr. Pierre, third assailant, and another gentleman then escorted the high schoolers to a private jet, which flew them to New Jersey. There were SUVs awaiting the group in Jersey, and the four of them were driven to Daddy's House Recording Studio, a studio famously owned and operated by Mr. Combs and Bad Boy. While at the studio, Mr. Combs and his associates, including Mr. Pierre, plied Miss Doe with drugs and alcohol. As the night wore on, the 17-year-old Miss Doe became more and more inebriated, eventually to the point that she could not possibly have consented to sex with anyone, much less someone twice her age. While at the studio, Miss Doe was raped by multiple people, including Mr. Combs and the third assailant, and Mr. Pierre, in that order. So when I say raped by multiple people, it's G-A-N-G, raped, but I can't say the word. So she was assaulted by those three individuals, and they're calling it a G-A-N-G, rape. Okay. When Mr. Combs was raping Miss Doe, he complained that he could not get off unless she pinched his nipples as hard as she could. Mr. Combs then watched on as third assailant, who Miss Doe had not even realized had begun to have sex with her, raped Miss Doe as she told him to stop. As the third assailant was finished, Mr. Pierre took his turn at raping Miss Doe and then violently forced her to give him oral, during which Miss Doe was choking and struggling to breathe. When Mr. Pierre finished, he left Miss Doe in the bathroom alone. Miss Doe fell into fetal position and lay on the floor. Her vagina was in pain. Finally, after a period of time, Miss Doe regained her bearings. However, she could barely stand up following the grape and had to be helped to walk out of the building and back into the car. She was taken to an airport and flown back to Michigan. However, she has very limited recollection of her transport home and only remembers being in her car sometime early in the morning. Unlike many victims who have come forward after decades, Miss Doe can prove that she not only met Mr. Combs on the night in question, but was in his studio in New York City with him on that night. Remembering reviewing these, Miss Doe was 17 years old. So she provided about four pictures, one of herself sitting on his lap, one looks like pointing to a logo. There's another one of a room with a couch and a mirror, and then there's another one of her in the studio with headphones on. Miss Doe had lived with her memories of this fateful night for 20 years, during which time she has suffered extreme emotional distress that has impacted nearly every aspect of her life and personal relationships, giving the brave women who have come forward against Mr. Combs and Mr. Pierre in recent weeks. Miss Doe is doing the same. To that end, Miss Doe brings this action seeking injunctive, declaratory, and monetary relief against defendants in violation of the Victims of Gender Motivated Violence Protection Law, Gender Motivated Violence Act, NYC, and then that's the statute. Okay, so then it goes over the jurisdiction and the venue and the parties involved. So the plaintiff Jane Doe is a citizen of Canada. Defendant Sean Combs is a citizen of the state of California. Defendant Harv, I don't know if it's Harvey or Harv Pierre, is a citizen of the state of New York. Defendant, the third assailant, is, upon information and belief, a citizen of the state of New York. Defendant Daddy's House Records is a music, media, and entertainment company founded and owned by defendant Sean Combs. Daddy's House is incorporated and headquartered in New York, New York. During the relevant time period, Daddy's House and or Sean Combs owned and operated the Daddy's House recording studio wherein Miss Doe was raped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and a third assailant. Defendant Bad Boy Entertainment Holdings is a music, media, and entertainment company founded and owned by defendant Sean Combs. Bad Boy is incorporated and headquartered in New York, New York. During the relevant time period, Bad Boy and or Sean Combs owned and operated the Daddy's House recording studio wherein Miss Doe was raped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and third assailant. All right, so here are the factual allegations of the lawsuit. In 2003, Miss Doe was a 17-year-old 11th grader residing in a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. At the time, Mr. Combs was 34 years old, twice the age of Miss Doe, and one of the most well-known and influential music artists of all time. A decade earlier, Mr. Combs founded Bad Boy and installed his longtime friend, Mr. Pierre, into the role of president. At the time, Mr. Combs had many connections to Michigan, including, among others, to the Black Mafia family, BMF, a drug trafficking and money laundering organization that is rumored to have seeded Bad Boy. Accordingly, upon information and belief, Mr. Combs' associates included Mr. Pierre and a third assailant spent significant time in and around Detroit, Michigan. On one evening between the spring and fall of 2003, Miss Doe was out with friends. It was not uncommon for her and her friends to frequent bars and lounges in the Detroit area. Certain of Miss Doe's friends were well connected with people in the music industry. On the evening in question, Miss Doe was with friends in a lounge when she was approached by who she later learned was Mr. Pierre. Mr. Pierre was with two of his friends, including the third assailant. Mr. Pierre, the third assailant, and their friends were dressed in suits. Mr. Pierre repeatedly complimented Miss Doe's appearance, saying that she was hot, among other things. He then began talking about his self-described best friend and brother, Mr. Combs. Specifically, Mr. Pierre continually stated that Mr. Combs would love to meet Miss Doe. Mr. Pierre even called Miss Combs and put Miss Doe on the line. Mr. Combs told Miss Doe that he would love to meet her and that she should accompany Mr. Pierre to New York City in a private jet. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Combs directed Miss Doe to go with him into the bathroom at the lounge. Once inside the bathroom, Mr. Pierre began to smoke cocaine in the rock form from what appeared to be an aluminum can. After he finished smoking, Mr. Pierre suddenly took out his and demanded that Miss Doe suck his and forced Miss Doe's head down to perform oral on him. After sexually assaulting Miss Doe, Mr. Pierre directed her to accompany him, the third assailant, and a third member of their group to an airport in Pontiac, Michigan, where Signature, a fixed base operator, had prepared a private jet to take the four of them to New York City. Upon information and belief, the private jet landed in Teterboro Airport. Upon departing the jet, two black SUVs were awaiting the group. Miss Doe got into the SUV with Mr. Pierre, and the third assailant and the other member of the group went into the SUV. The SUVs brought the group to Daddy's House Recording Studio, a recording studio and hangout owned and operated by Mr. Combs and Bad Boy. When Miss Doe arrived, she was escorted into the building where she distinctly remembers seeing a sign for the company, Technicolor. Upon entering the studio, Miss Doe first encountered Mr. Combs. At the time she arrived, a female recording artist was using the studio as Mr. Combs and her parents watched on. She finished up shortly after Miss Doe arrived and left. While still in the studio section of Daddy's house, Mr. Combs asked Miss Doe to sit on his lap and take a picture. A copy of the photograph is below. Okay, here's the photograph. While the evening became a blur, Miss Doe does recall Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and the third assailant hitting on her incessantly, stroking her body, and asking her to shake her ass and telling her how hot and sexy she was. Various other pictures were taken in the studio that night, leaving no doubt that Miss Doe was in Mr. Combs' New York City studio with Mr. Combs on the night she was raped. And so here are the other pictures that I explained earlier, the one with the couch, her in the studio booth, the recording booth, and then another one, I guess, in front of a logo. As the night wore on, the 17-year-old Miss Doe became more and more inebriated, eventually to the point that she could not possibly have consented to having sex with anyone, much less someone twice her age. Nevertheless, that evening, Mr. Combs directed Miss Doe to accompany him to the bathroom at the studio. Once there, Mr. Combs removed Miss Doe's skirt and underwear and penetrated her from behind with his while she bent over the sink. Miss Doe did not consent to having sex with Mr. Combs, but he continued thrusting. At some point, Mr. Combs turned Miss Doe around to face him. He told her that he could not orgasm and asked her to squeeze his nipples as hard as she could to help him get off. He then turned her back around and continued to grape her. By this point, Miss Doe was coming in and out of consciousness because of the drugs and alcohol she had been given by defendants. Her next memory was looking up into the mirror above the sink to find that the third assailant had replaced Mr. Combs and was graping her from behind. Mr. Combs was watching the third assistant sexually assault Miss Doe from a chair outside of the bathroom. At this point, Miss Doe mustered the energy to tell the third assailant to stop and that she did not want to be having sex with him. The third assailant did not stop and continued to grape Miss Doe, who did not have the strength to force him off of her. After the third assailant was finished, he was replaced by Mr. Pierre, who began by having non-consensual vaginal sex with Miss Doe before violently forcing her to give him oral. During the latter part of the sexual assault, Mr. Pierre forced his into Miss Doe's mouth without her consent. Miss Doe remembered that Mr. Pierre was sweaty and that he had difficulty breathing. When Mr. Pierre finished, he left Miss Doe in the bathroom alone. Miss Doe fell into the fetal position and lay on the floor. Her vagina was in pain. Finally, after a period of time, Miss Doe regained her bearings. However, she could barely stand up following the grape and had to be helped to walk out of the building and back into the car. She was taken back to the airport and flown back to Michigan. However, she has very limited recollection of her transport home, and she only remembers being in her car sometime early in the morning. Her underwear was missing. As a result of being raped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and a third assailant, Miss Doe suffered significant emotional distress and feels the shame that has plagued her life and personal relationships for 20 years. Miss Doe knew that speaking out against defendants would be extremely difficult and that she would likely be subjected to retaliation and defamatory slurs and attacks. However, in 2023, Ms. Doe read about a lawsuit filed against Mr. Combs by Cassie. Ms. Ventura's suit described a decade of physical and sexual and mental abuse. Most triggering for Ms. Doe was reading about Ms. Ventura's allegations of ex trafficking and being forced to have sex with other men against her will. Ms. Doe obviously understands that she too had been ex trafficked and that Mr. Combs' behavior in forcing women into non consensual sex was not an isolated incident or unique only to Ms. Ventura. Then, just days later, Ms. Doe read about a case filed against Mr. Pierre. The suit alleged that Mr. Pierre used his position of power at Bad Boy to groom and sexually assault his former assistant. There was not an immediate response from Diddy or his lawyers, except for the fact that they vehemently denied knowing this young lady and that anything took place. But on May the 13th of this year, Diddy's lawyers did file a motion to dismiss, specifically because not only do they deny the allegations, but they feel as though the pictures that were provided in the lawsuit are false and that the accuser has not been able to provide a specific day or time of the year as to when the abuse took place. And so they believe that the motion should be filed and that the case should be dismissed. Another update for this case is that the judge ruled that Jane Doe cannot remain anonymous. And so she at some point has to reveal her identity or the case will be thrown out. Now, this is not an immediate cause of action since Diddy has filed or Diddy's attorneys have filed a motion to dismiss. And so the judge will rule on the motion to dismiss first. And if his motion to dismiss is denied, Jane Doe will have to come forth with her identity. Now, the judge did use Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, R. Kelly, and even Jeffrey Epstein's cases as a reference point to victims having to supply their identity in matters such as what Mr. Combs is facing now. So that is it for that particular lawsuit. We'll keep our ear to the street to see what is new. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.